people won't have the luxury of being exempt from extra fuel and car taxes because in the way that ministers are as they're driven around in state cars. So there's a wider gap than ever between what ministers experience day to day themselves and the reality of belt tightening that families will have to endure. Really, people in the ordinary economy are living in many ways in a parallel universe to what ministers in this government are living in. The changes in the stamp duty today proposed are really a humiliation for the Minister for Finance. Back in June, he brought in stamp duty reforms which he told us would restore stability and certainty to the housing market. He told us that the changes would be good for certainty, good for affordability and good for society. Today, he had to return to the tax for a second time in just under 6 months with his tail between his legs. This is an admission of economic incompetence. The Minister has mismanaged and misjudged the housing market, and the exchequer borrowing he is announcing today is the direct result of that. The bungling of the stamp duty issue by the government has really been extraordinary. The flight from the housing market first began with former Minister Michael McDowell's attention-grabbing stunt when he declared that stamp duty could be abolished because less than 9 months ago the government didn't need the revenue, just imagine, if I remember what he had to say. It was followed by months of the government doing nothing, in turn followed by a badly constructed and inadequate reform in June of this year. What the government didn't realise was that the stamp duty in the housing market the problem wasn't simply about first-time buyers. It was particularly about those trading up. And Minister, if I may say so, in the reform proposals put forward by the Labour Party, both last year and before the election, we pointed to the difficulties for the trader-uppers, the people who had exhausted their first-time buyers relief on buying an apartment, but 5 years later had 1 or 2 children and desperately needed to buy a family home. We told you that that was where one of the critical problems was, but you refused to listen. Since then, the housing market has slumped, and the Minister is now trying to rescue it from the wreckage of his policy. And it's interesting, that old habits die hard with the Minister. For somebody buying a house, a second-hand house for $500,000 in the Dublin area, not an unusual price even in the falling market, they'll save €11,250, and that of course, Minister, is welcome. But it's important to note that at the bottom of your table, somebody buying a house for $2 million will actually save $28,750. And that's the way all these reforms go. Just as with the reform in June, you abolished it so that many of the people who benefited were very wealthy families able to spend $1 million plus on houses for their young people. Again, this particular reform, the more you have, the better you do. Now, Minister, in the real world, things happen. Oil shocks, climate shocks, wars, a subprime crisis. I think I was the first person to mention that word in this House. And I remember one of the journalists working here asking me, what did subprime mean? Now every junior bank clerk and first-year economics students knows all about it. So stuff happens, as Harold Macmillan used to say, events, dear boy, events. Plans for spending and taxation should take into account these huge uncertainties that a frothy housing market generates for consumer demand, not just here, but right across the developed world. You need a contingency reserve in your plans for what may happen yet. And I just don't see one in what I heard from you today. The changes in the housing market are a huge concern for many people in this country, and not simply of concern to the banks and the financial institutions who are worried about the quality of their land and property lending. Before the election, The Minister and Fianna Fáil boosted the housing bubble just about as far as it could go, and now that the bubble has burst, the consequences for many ordinary families may be very severe. Although Irish house prices are falling, they still remain extraordinarily high by international standards. In today's climate of much higher interest rates, young people who want to get into the housing market simply cannot afford the $350,000 to $450,000 that has been demanded in our cities for very modest 1- and 2-bed houses and apartments. Funding a total mortgage cost of $1,600 a month on a home cost of around $350,000. That is an enormous financial strain on most young people whose earnings simply have not kept pace with the rate of interest rate rises. The bursting of the housing bubble is fundamentally because house prices in Ireland were encouraged by your government to rise to ridiculous levels. While house construction costs rose in this country, they rose nothing like the bubble in land prices. Crazy land prices for developers speculating in land fed into enormous price increases for very modest family homes. Given the close relationship between Fianna Fáil and the developers, we can't suggest that Fianna Fáil, the Minister for Finance and the Taoiseach didn't know about this. They chose to put their heads in the sand and allow the market to be stoked even higher. The Irish banks have been willing accomplices in allowing land for housing for families to be bid up to crazy prices, and much of that speculation took place not just in a tax-free environment, but in an environment where the Minister and his predecessor created an endless range of unnecessary tax breaks for property-based investment.